I would like to congratulate the organisers because I fully share the premise which underlines this meeting, namely that there is no one-size-fits-all model of transition to democracy. And in fact, the sooner we move away from this notion, the better we will all be. I strongly recommend an article by an American political scientist called Thomas Carothers, entitled The End of the Transition Paradigm, which was published in the Journal of Democracy in 2002. And Carothers makes precisely this point, in other words, that we have insisted on looking at events in the Arab world, North Africa, through the prism of transitology, and this is in fact becoming rather misleading, if not downright counterproductive. And he comes to three important conclusions that I would like to underline before I start discussing the Spanish example very briefly. The first, of course, is rather worrying, and that is that we have tended to assume that as soon as countries cease to be authoritarian dictatorships, they automatically embark on a process of democratization, which will inevitably lead to functioning democracies. And the very important point that Carothers makes is that this may not in fact be the case. A lot of Arab countries, sadly, may be stuck in limbo. They are really not in transit to democracy. They are simply developing other kinds of political institutions, what we often describe as illiberal democracy. And of course, this is not just true of Arab countries, but countries elsewhere in the world. Secondly, Carothers argues that transitologists have consistently underestimated the importance of the state. So one of his big slogans, if you like, is let's bring the state back in. Because in fact, as many of you know from your own countries, state building turns out to be one of the most challenging processes involved in democratization. And the third important point that he makes is that transitology, whose informal slogan, I suppose, resembles that of Mr. Obama, yes we can, should actually think again about background structural conditions. Transitologists, ever since Rostow, whom you mentioned, have tended to overemphasize in the long-standing debate between structure and agency. They have tended to overemphasize the autonomy of agency. In other words, they have led us to believe that ultimately transitions are about political will. Transitions can be carried out as long as the political will of the elites is present. And Carothers basically reminds us that certain background structural conditions, such as the levels of socioeconomic development, ethnic and religious divisions, and the political history of the countries involved should also be taken into account. And those, I think, are interesting caveats to keep in mind throughout today and tomorrow's discussions. This debate is, of course, relevant to the Spanish case, and I'll make a few very quick remarks about Spain. Of course, Spain had a very mixed historical record. It had had a rather difficult experience with liberalism in the 19th century, although it did develop liberal parliamentary institutions. Spaniards experienced with political parties, with parliaments, and with constitutions, and with free speech. In fact, Spain has probably produced more constitutions than was a good thing for it, starting with the famous Constitution of 1812. At the same time, though, Spain experienced a very brief and tumultuous democratic episode or experience, regime, in the 1930s, the Second Republic, from 1931 to 1936. And as you know, this experience or experiment in democracy, ultimately, in fact, Spain's first transition to democracy, was interrupted by a bloody 3-year civil war, which gave way to 40 years of authoritarian dictatorship. At the same time, however, in the 1960s and early 70s, Spain experienced a very rapid process of socioeconomic growth, which led to accelerated industrialization and urbanization. It led to the eradication of hunger and illiteracy, and the emergence of a relatively large middle class. Add to this the fact that in the 1970s, Spain benefited enormously from a highly favorable international environment. This is something that also has to be factored in. In particular, a highly favorable European environment. Authoritarianism had effectively become an intolerable anomaly by 1974 after the collapse of the Greek and Portuguese dictatorships. So, in one sense, you could argue that the success of the Spanish case was overdetermined by these socioeconomic transformations that I've mentioned, and also by this favourable international context. At the same time, however, the transition itself posed enormous problems. Spain, of course, was a victim of the economic downturn that started with the oil crisis of 1973. There was considerable social unrest during the transition process, and contrary to what is often said, there was also considerable violence. Quite a number of people were killed during the Spanish transition. This is sometimes forgotten, not only in terrorist attacks by extreme left-wing and extreme right-wing and separatist Basque terrorist organization, but also by people involved in street demonstrations, sit-ins and marches. So although we generally describe the Spanish transition as peaceful, we have to be careful about how we use this adjective. Now, traditionally, transitologists have seen Spain as probably one of the most successful transitions of the so-called third wave. It has often been described as a transition via transaction, and one author has even described it as the very model of the modern elite settlement. So what all of this stresses is the fact that the elites in Spain came together for a whole series of reasons and negotiated the process. Now, there is, let me just remind you as well, a bit of a danger in this characterization, because it may lead us to overstate the role of agency versus the role of structure, as I was suggesting earlier. It may lead us to exaggerate the role of individuals and the role of political elites, and to forget about the people, the masses, social movements, and so on. Of course, social movements are more than just a backdrop against which elite arrangements are reached. And we might end up thinking of the transition as a process involving democracy for the people, but without the people. And this, of course, would be a mistake. So let me say a few words about the constitution writing process, which is the subject of this first session. Countries which are democratizing basically all face three possibilities when they deal with the constitutional issue. The first option, normally, is to restore a previously existing constitution, if they had a previously existing democratic constitution. The second possibility is to reform and improve an existing, perhaps not necessarily very democratic, but nevertheless usable constitution. And the third option is to start from scratch and to produce an entirely new document. This, for obvious symbolic and political reasons, is often the most attractive option. It is probably also sometimes the most difficult. In the Spanish case, the third option was really the only serious option that was ever discussed. There was, of course, a previously existing modern democratic constitution, that of 1931, the Republican Constitution, but as I mentioned earlier, the fact that the Second Republic had ended in disaster, and the fact also that it was Republican and not a monarchical constitution, ruled that option out. So how was the Constitution tackled? Basically, the Constitution was written by MPs, by members of Parliament. It was a very inclusive process. It included people from across the political spectrum, from communists to former Francoists, and it was also inclusive in the sense that Spain's minorities, national minorities represented by a Catalan nationalist, were also part of the process. So I would regard this as a pretty inclusive process. It was also very protracted. It lasted from July 77 to December 78, that's 1.5 years. Now, that's a long time for a constituent process, but I would argue that in the Spanish case, this paid dividends in the sense that it allowed the media and public opinion to discuss all of the issues involved in an open and actually quite pedagogic manner. The title of this session refers to fault lines, or what we sometimes call cleavages. And I would argue that the people who wrote the Spanish Constitution, the founding fathers, had to deal with 6 cleavages at least. The first was the monarchy versus republic cleavage. The second was the territorial cleavage, or center versus periphery. The third was the church-state cleavage, how to deal with religion. The fourth was the civil-military cleavage. The fifth was the socioeconomic cleavage. And the sixth was what I'm going to describe as the institutional cleavage. And this long, protracted constituent process developed against the background, which I think is important to keep in mind, against 2 background conditions. The first is an overriding determination to avoid civic strife, in fact, to avoid another civil war. And you could argue that the slogan of the Spanish transition was simply "never again." And secondly, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that the democratizing process took place in the context of considerable political violence meant that fear of confrontation was not just academic, it was quite real. So let me deal very quickly with some of these cleavages. The first, the monarchy versus republic. Now, as you know, King Juan Carlos inherited the throne from Franco. He became King of Spain in November 1975. And he advocated this process of democratization and indeed facilitated it. So not surprisingly, the political parties who had taken part in the first democratic elections, held in '77, by and large agreed that the new constitution should accept the monarchy and institutionalize it. And there are 2 points here that I want to emphasize. The first was that left-wing parties effectively accepted the monarchy on the condition that it would be deprived of any effective executive power. So, as in other Western-style monarchies, the king was basically left with essentially symbolic powers. And the second interesting mechanism was that the monarchy was put to the vote. It was put to the vote in the Constitutional Committee. And the institution's democratic legitimacy was therefore directly related to this vote. Secondly, the territorial cleavage. This was undoubtedly the most complex issue that Spaniards had to face. The underlying challenge was how to reconcile unity with diversity. The 1978 Constitution, still in force today, recognizes, on the one hand, what it describes as the indissoluble unity of the Spanish nation, while at the same time recognizing the right to autonomy of Spain's, quote, regions and nationalities. Now, as I'm sure you've immediately detected, there is an inherent ambiguity in this. What is a nationality if it is not a nation? Does this mean, then, that the Spanish Constitution effectively creates a nation of nations? These are debates which we continue to these are issues that we continue to debate 35 years later. To sum it up very quickly, you could argue that the Constitution half-heartedly recognized the multilingual and multinational character of Spanish society. The important point is that this was accepted at the time by Catalan nationalists, but not by their Basque counterparts, who never formally endorsed the Constitution, although they accepted its legitimacy. So this is probably the biggest failure, if you like, of the constituent process. In other words, it was not able to incorporate all of these demands. Thirdly, very quickly, civil-military relations. The Constitution was much more successful here. It fully imposed civilian supremacy, say in marked contrast to the new Egyptian Constitution. There was some pushback, of course, on the part of the more conservative elements in the armed forces, and as you will recall, there was even an attempted aborted coup in 1981. Nevertheless, the Constitution laid the foundations for deep reforms in the 1980s, which basically transformed the military institutions and procedures out of recognition. So civil-military relations was really a task which was only fully tackled during the consolidation phase of the democratizing process, not during the transition proper. The fourth cleavage is the socioeconomic cleavage. In other words, how to reconcile the demands of the left and the demands of the right. Spain was already, of course, a social market economy, but it was a primitive market economy, and therefore the Constitution tried to modernize the system. In Spain, there was widespread support for increasing public spending. This was associated with democratization, with a view to creating a Western-style welfare state. So the result can be described, and is formally described in the Constitution, as a social market economy, which I would argue basically reflects the neo-Keynesian consensus that existed in the country at the time. Let me remind you, the Spanish Constitution was adopted in '78, that is the year before Mrs. Thatcher was elected, and of course before the Reagan Revolution began in the US. So I think one can fairly describe this as a neo-Keynesian consensus as far as the role of the state in the economy is concerned. Fifthly, church-state relations. Again, here we have a compromise solution. The Constitution declared that Spain was a non-confessional state, so what we have therefore is a divorce, a separation between church and state, but at the same time the Constitution formally acknowledges the prominent role of Catholicism in Spanish life. And in practice, this is present in the articles which deal with matters relating to education. The Spanish state, even today, for example, is obliged to provide religious instruction in state schools. And finally, the institutional settlement, which I would say is an aspect that people are most critical of, although, of course, as you well know, people are very critical of the territorial settlement as well, and indeed the monarchy versus republic settlement. The point I want to make here, and it would be interesting to see the extent to which this is happening in some Arab countries, is that the founding fathers of the new Spanish democracy were probably overly concerned with the lessons of the past. It's ironic, and I'm a historian, but it's ironic that an excessive knowledge of the past may actually be a bad thing. So you know the expression in English, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. These people had a lot of knowledge. But it turned out to be counterproductive. What do I mean? Well, basically, they legislated with their eyes on the rear view mirror, like when you drive. And what they saw in the rear view mirror was the 1930s. What they saw in the rear view mirror was the Spanish Constitution of 1931. And they didn't, on the whole, like what they saw in the rear view mirror. They identified this constitution and the political system that it created with party factionalism, with weak coalition governments, and in general with political instability. And this led them to overcompensate. They devised an electoral system, for example, which benefited large statewide parties or nationwide parties to the detriment of small nationwide parties. They created a very strong executive, or a model which would favor strong executives, and weak parliaments. And in fact, they have been extremely successful. There have only been 5 prime ministers in Spain since 1978. And they also made sure that the constitution would be a rigid one, making constitutional reform extremely difficult. Of course, the concern at the time was that alternation in office would lead to new minorities, and every new minority would try to modify the constitution to suit its own interests. The way to avoid this, as I say, was to create a very rigid constitution. The result, however, is that today, even those who believe, and I would certainly count myself among them, that the 1978 Constitution has served Spain well on the whole, should nevertheless now, finally, after 35 years, be reformed quite substantially. Let me finish with a final paradox. What is the relationship between the way in which a constitution is negotiated and the political system to which it gives birth? Well, the paradox in Spain is that the constitution was negotiated through a consensual process, a very inclusive consensual process. But ironically, the resulting system was majoritarian. There has never been a coalition government in Spain, for example, ever, since 1978. So even if you negotiate this new constitution in a consensual manner, and some academics at the time believed that the Spanish system would be consociational, like the Dutch system, for example, the resulting system may in fact have an entirely different dynamic, in this case a majoritarian dynamic. And I will leave my remarks there. I want to be a moderate moderator.